In the autumn of 1868, the Colorado Territory still bore the scars of recent conflicts. Mining camps dotted the landscape like festering wounds, while ghost towns whispered tales of fortune seekers who'd vanished into the unforgiving wilderness. Among these settlements stood Silverbrook, a place where dreams came to die and nightmares took root in the rocky soil. The town's main street stretched like a dusty spine between weathered buildings, their facades already showing signs of premature aging despite being barely 5 years old. Saloons, general stores, and boarding houses lined the thoroughfare, while beyond them loomed the imposing peaks of the Rocky Mountains, their snow-capped summits serving as silent sentinels over the struggling community below. It was here that Marcus Whitmore first arrived, his paint-stained fingers gripping the reins of a tired horse, pulling a wagon loaded with canvases, easels, and mysterious bottles filled with pigments of unusual hues. The townspeople watched with curious eyes as this pale, gaunt figure in a worn black coat made his way down their street, his piercing blue eyes scanning the landscape as if searching for something only he could see. What drew an artist to such a desolate place remained a mystery to the locals, who were more concerned with extracting silver from the mountains than creating beauty on canvas. Yet Whitmore seemed oddly at home among the harsh angles and muted colors of this frontier town, setting up his studio in an abandoned shop that had once housed a failed photographer's business. The Western Territories had always been a magnet for those fleeing their past, and American folklore was rich with tales of individuals who sought redemption or reinvention in these untamed lands. But sometimes the wilderness had its own plans for those who dared to make it their home. And the true horror stories that emerged from these places often defied rational explanation. Marcus Whitmore's studio occupied the corner building on Main Street, its large windows facing both the town square and the mountain vista beyond. The previous occupant, a daguerreotypist named Henderson, had fled under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind equipment that the locals whispered had captured more than just images. Whitmore seemed unbothered by such gossip, transforming the space into an artist's sanctuary, filled with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil. The townspeople initially approached him with the wariness typical of frontier communities toward strangers. However, Whitmore's offer to paint portraits at reasonable prices soon drew customers to his door. Unlike the stiff, formal poses captured by traveling photographers, his paintings seemed to breathe with life, capturing not just the physical likeness, but something deeper within his subjects' souls. Mrs. Catherine Mills, the banker's wife, was among his first clients. She sat for hours in his studio, mesmerized by the artist's technique and his peculiar habit of mixing his paints with what appeared to be mountain spring water collected under specific lunar phases. The resulting portrait was stunning, showing her not as the weathered frontier woman she'd become, but as the vibrant young bride she'd once been. Word of Whitmore's extraordinary talent spread quickly through Silverbrook and beyond. Miners fresh from successful claims commissioned paintings to send back to families in the East. Merchants wanted their likenesses preserved before the harsh environment aged them beyond recognition. Even the town's preacher, initially suspicious of artistic pursuits, found himself drawn to the studio's mysterious atmosphere. Yet, those who spent time in Whitmore's presence began to notice something unsettling. While his subjects seemed to grow younger and more vibrant with each session, The artist himself appeared unchanged by the passing months, maintaining the same pale complexion and ageless features that had marked his arrival in Silverbrook. Whitmore's painting technique fascinated those who witnessed it firsthand. He worked with brushes crafted from materials no one could identify, their bristles catching light in ways that seemed to bend natural law. His palette contained pigments that shifted color depending on the angle of observation, creating depth and luminosity that made his subjects appear ready to step from their frames. The artist claimed his methods were rooted in ancient European traditions passed down through generations of his family. He spoke of masters who understood that true portraiture required capturing not just appearance, but the very essence of life itself. His clients found themselves entranced by these explanations, often losing track of time during their lengthy sitting sessions. Dr. Samuel Warren, the town's physician and one of its few educated residents, became particularly intrigued by Whitmore's work. As a man of science, Warren was skeptical of claims about mystical painting techniques, yet he couldn't deny the remarkable transformations he witnessed in the artist's subjects. People who entered the studio looking worn and aged emerged with a vitality that seemed to defy the harsh realities of frontier life. The doctor's own portrait session revealed more of Whitmore's unusual methods. The artist insisted on painting during specific hours, claiming the quality of light was crucial to his process. He also required complete silence from his subjects, explaining that conversation disrupted the delicate balance necessary for capturing their true essence on canvas. As Warren sat motionless, he observed Whitmore's movements with clinical precision. The artist's hands never trembled despite his apparent age, and his eyes held an intensity that seemed to pierce through surface appearances to something deeper beneath. Most disturbing of all, Warren noticed that Whitmore cast no reflection in the studio's many mirrors, though he dismissed this observation as a trick of the unusual lighting conditions. 3 months after Whitmore's arrival, the first signs of something amiss began to surface in Silverbrook. Mrs. Mills, whose portrait had been the artist's initial triumph, started experiencing disturbing dreams where she felt herself being pulled into her own painted image. She would wake with the sensation of paint on her skin, though no physical traces could be found upon examination. Other clients reported similar experiences. Thomas Brennan, a successful mine owner, found himself staring at his portrait for hours, unable to shake the feeling that his painted self was somehow more real than his flesh and blood body. The artwork seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the eyes following viewers around the room with unnerving persistence. Dr. Warren documented these accounts with growing concern. As a medical professional, he initially attributed the phenomena to psychological suggestion or the stress of frontier living. However, the consistency of the reports and the specific nature of the symptoms suggested something more complex was occurring within the confines of Whitmore's studio. The physician began conducting discreet examinations of the artist's clients, measuring their vital signs and documenting their physical condition. What he discovered defied medical understanding. Those who had sat for portraits showed signs of cellular regeneration typically associated with much younger individuals. Their hair grew thicker, their skin became more supple, and minor ailments that had plagued them for years seemed to mysteriously resolve. Meanwhile, Whitmore himself remained unchanged, working tirelessly on new commissions while maintaining the same enigmatic demeanor that had marked his arrival. He showed no signs of fatigue despite the long hours spent in his studio, and his appearance remained as ageless and pale as the day he'd first set foot in Silverbrook. As winter approached, Silverbrook began to transform in ways that extended beyond the seasonal changes typical of mountain communities. The town's atmosphere grew heavy with an inexplicable tension, as if the very air had become thick with unspoken secrets. Residents who had never been prone to superstition found themselves crossing themselves when passing Whitmore's studio, though they couldn't articulate the source of their unease. The artist's clientele continued to expand despite the growing whispers of concern. Visitors from neighboring settlements traveled considerable distances to commission portraits drawn by reports of Whitmore's miraculous ability to restore youth and vitality to his subjects. The studio became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to reclaim their lost years through the mysterious power of his brush. Sheriff Jake Morrison, a practical man with little patience for supernatural nonsense, initially dismissed the growing rumors as frontier foolishness. However, his skepticism began to waver when his own wife, Eleanor, commissioned a portrait and emerged from the studio looking 20 years younger. The transformation was so dramatic that strangers on the street failed to recognize her, mistaking her for her own daughter. The economic impact of Whitmore's presence became undeniable as Silverbrook experienced an unexpected boom. The boarding house filled with visitors, the saloons overflowed with customers celebrating their renewed appearances, and local merchants struggled to keep up with demand for mirrors and cosmetics as people marveled at their transformed reflections. Yet beneath this prosperity lurked a growing sense of dread that manifested in subtle ways. Dogs refused to approach the studio, horses became skittish when tied nearby, and even the hardy mountain birds that typically scavenged throughout the town avoided the artist's corner of Main Street, as if sensing some invisible boundary they dared not cross. Dr. Warren's scientific curiosity compelled him to delve deeper into the mystery surrounding Whitmore's extraordinary abilities. He began maintaining detailed records of every individual who sat for a portrait, documenting their physical condition before and after their sessions with meticulous precision. The data he collected painted a picture that challenged everything he understood about human physiology and the natural aging process. The physician discovered that the transformations weren't merely cosmetic improvements, but genuine reversals of cellular degradation. Arthritis symptoms disappeared, vision sharpened, and even old injuries healed with remarkable speed. Some clients reported increased energy levels and mental clarity that they hadn't experienced since their youth, as if the painting process had somehow reset their biological clocks. Warren's investigation led him to research historical accounts of similar phenomena, poring over medical journals and folklore collections in search of precedents. He found scattered references to artists throughout history who had claimed the ability to capture and manipulate the essence of life itself, though most of these accounts were dismissed as mythology or deliberate fraud by the scientific community. The doctor's growing obsession with understanding Whitmore's methods strained his relationship with his wife and patients. He spent increasingly long hours in his study, surrounded by books on alchemy, ancient medicine, and supernatural phenomena. His rational worldview, built on years of medical training and scientific observation, began to crumble under the weight of evidence that defied logical explanation. One evening, while examining blood samples from Whitmore's clients under his microscope, Warren made a disturbing discovery. The cellular structure of their blood appeared fundamentally altered, containing elements that didn't match any known biological patterns. The implications of this finding sent a chill through his soul, suggesting that the artist's process involved more than mere paint and canvas. Reverend Josiah Stone had initially welcomed Whitmore's arrival in Silverbrook, viewing the artist's presence as a sign of cultural refinement in their rough frontier community. However, as reports of miraculous transformation spread throughout the town, the preacher's enthusiasm gave way to deep theological concerns about the nature of the changes he witnessed among his congregation. The Reverend found himself grappling with questions that challenged his understanding of divine will and natural order. If God had decreed that humans should age and eventually return to dust, what did it mean when an artist could seemingly reverse this fundamental aspect of mortal existence? The implications troubled his sleep and haunted his prayers as he sought guidance from Scripture. Stone noticed changes in the behavior of congregation members who had sat for portraits. While their physical appearances had improved dramatically, their spiritual demeanor seemed somehow diminished. They attended services less frequently, showed decreased interest in matters of salvation, and appeared more concerned with earthly pleasures than heavenly rewards. The transformation seemed to have awakened a vanity that troubled the preacher's soul. The Reverend's attempts to discuss these concerns with affected parishioners met with dismissive responses and, in some cases, outright hostility. Mrs. Mills, once a pillar of the church community, accused him of jealousy over her renewed youth and beauty. Thomas Brennan questioned the relevance of religious teachings when earthly paradise could be achieved through more immediate means. As winter deepened and the snow began to fall in earnest, Reverend Stone found himself increasingly isolated from his own congregation. The church attendance dwindled as more residents sought salvation through Whitmore's paintbrush rather than through prayer and devotion, leaving the preacher to wonder if he was witnessing the corruption of souls rather than the restoration of bodies. The harsh Colorado winter typically drove Silverbrook's residents indoors, creating a sense of community as families huddled together around fires and shared stories to pass the long, dark months. However, the winter of 1868-1869 proved different as Whitmore's studio became the town's primary gathering place, its warm glow beckoning to those seeking transformation rather than mere shelter from the elements. The artist announced that winter sessions would be even more powerful than those conducted during warmer months, explaining that the pure mountain snow provided essential elements for his unique pigments. He claimed that paintings created during this season would possess enhanced properties, offering not just youth restoration, but protection against the harsh realities of frontier life. Demand for appointments became so intense that fights broke out among prospective clients, with some offering exorbitant sums to secure earlier session times. The town's social hierarchy began to reshape itself around access to Whitmore's services, creating new divisions between the enhanced and the unaltered that threatened the community's traditional bonds. Sheriff Morrison found himself dealing with an unprecedented number of disputes related to portrait appointments and accusations of queue jumping. The situation became so volatile that he was forced to establish a formal scheduling system and post guards outside the studio to maintain order among the increasingly desperate crowds. The winter storms that typically isolated Silverbrook seemed to have no effect on visitors seeking Whitmore's services. Travelers arrived despite treacherous conditions, their determination to reach the artist's studio overriding concerns for their personal safety. Some arrived half-frozen, more dead than alive, yet emerged from their sessions not only restored to health, but appearing more vital than they had in decades. Dr. Warren's midnight visits to the studio, conducted while Whitmore was absent on his mysterious nocturnal wanderings, revealed disturbing truths about the portraits themselves. The paintings, when examined in darkness, seemed to emit a faint phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with what could only be described as a heartbeat. The effect was subtle but undeniable, suggesting that the artworks contained some form of living essence. The physician discovered that each portrait bore tiny inscriptions along the frame's inner edges, written in a script that didn't match any language he recognized. The symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, making documentation nearly impossible. However, he noticed that these markings corresponded to specific anatomical points on the painted subjects, as if creating some form of mystical connection between art and flesh. Warren's examination of the paint itself revealed an even more shocking truth. Microscopic analysis showed that the pigments contained cellular material that appeared to be of human origin, though the cells remained mysteriously vital despite being incorporated into the paint medium. The implications of this discovery sent waves of revulsion and terror through the doctor's scientific mind. The portrait's eyes proved particularly disturbing upon close inspection. They seemed to track movement even when the viewer remained stationary, and Warren swore he could detect subtle changes in their expression depending on the time of day and lighting conditions. The painted subjects appeared to be aware of their surroundings, trapped within their frames, yet somehow conscious of the world beyond. Most terrifying of all, Warren noticed that the portraits aged in reverse proportion to their living subjects. As the real individuals grew younger and more vital, their painted counterparts showed signs of increasing age and decay, as if some cosmic balance was being maintained through the transfer of temporal essence from canvas to flesh. Eleanor Morrison, the sheriff's wife, was the first to vanish without explanation. Her disappearance occurred 3 weeks after her portrait session, during a snowstorm that should have kept everyone safely indoors. She had retired to bed as usual, but was gone by morning, leaving no tracks in the fresh snow and no sign of struggle in their modest home. Sheriff Morrison's investigation revealed that Eleanor had been experiencing increasingly vivid dreams about her portrait, claiming that her painted self was calling to her from within the frame. She had begun spending hours each day staring at the artwork, sometimes speaking to it as if engaged in conversation with her own reflection. Her husband had initially attributed this behavior to the natural fascination people felt with their transformed appearances. The search for Eleanor proved fruitless, despite the sheriff's mobilization of every able-bodied man in town. The fresh snow should have preserved any tracks, yet no trace of her passage could be found beyond their front door. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the portrait that now seemed to smile with a satisfaction that chilled those who gazed upon it. Whitmore expressed appropriate concern over Eleanor's disappearance, offering to assist in the search efforts. However, several residents noticed that the artist seemed unusually energetic following the incident, his pale complexion taking on a healthier glow that contrasted starkly with the sheriff's haggard appearance. The timing of this improvement struck some as more than coincidental. The portrait of Eleanor remained in the Morrison home, but those who visited noticed disturbing changes in the painted image. The figure appeared more three-dimensional than before, and some swore they could see the rise and fall of painted breath beneath the subject's dress. Most unsettling of all, the portrait seemed to age at an accelerated rate, showing signs of decay that spread like infection across the canvas. Within days of Eleanor's disappearance, Thomas Brennan also vanished from his locked bedroom, leaving behind only his portrait and a small pile of ash on the windowsill. Like Eleanor, he had been exhibiting strange behavior in the weeks following his painting session, claiming that his reflection in mirrors no longer matched his physical appearance and that he felt increasingly disconnected from his own body. Dr. Warren began to see the horrifying pattern that connected the disappearances to Whitmore's artistic process. Those who vanished had all reported similar experiences, vivid dreams about their portraits, a growing sense of detachment from their physical selves, and the feeling that their painted images were somehow more real than their flesh and blood bodies. The physician's investigation revealed that the missing individuals had all received multiple portrait sessions, unlike other clients who had been satisfied with single paintings. Whitmore had convinced them that additional sittings would enhance and maintain their transformations, drawing them deeper into whatever mystical process powered his extraordinary abilities. Mrs. Mills, who had also undergone multiple sessions, began experiencing the same symptoms that had preceded the other disappearances. She complained of feeling translucent, as if her substance was slowly being drained away and transferred to her painted image. Her family noticed that she cast an increasingly faint shadow, and that her voice seemed to echo as if coming from a great distance. The remaining portraits of the vanished individuals continued to change in disturbing ways. They appeared more lifelike with each passing day, while simultaneously showing signs of supernatural decay around the edges. It was as if two competing forces were at work within the paintings, one seeking to grant eternal life, the other demanding the inevitable price of such unnatural preservation. Sheriff Morrison, driven by grief and mounting suspicion, confronted Whitmore directly about the disappearances plaguing Silverbrook. The artist received his accusations with calm denial, expressing sympathy for the families affected and suggesting that the harsh winter conditions might have claimed the missing individuals despite the lack of evidence supporting such a theory. The confrontation took place in Whitmore's studio, surrounded by dozens of portraits that seemed to watch the proceedings with painted eyes full of malevolent intelligence. Morrison felt the weight of their collective gaze as he pressed the artist for answers, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon at his side, despite his uncertainty about whether conventional force could affect whatever Whitmore truly was. Whitmore's demeanor during the confrontation revealed glimpses of his true nature. His voice carried harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the listener's soul, and his movements possessed a fluid grace that defied the limitations of human anatomy. Most unsettling of all, his shadow fell in directions that contradicted the studio's lighting, suggesting he existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. The artist offered to paint the sheriff's portrait free of charge, claiming it would help ease his grief over Eleanor's disappearance. The suggestion carried an almost hypnotic compulsion that Morrison found difficult to resist, despite his growing certainty that accepting would seal his fate. Only his love for his missing wife and his duty to protect the remaining townspeople gave him the strength to refuse. As Morrison prepared to leave, he noticed that Eleanor's portrait now bore a striking resemblance to the woman he had married 30 years earlier, but the eyes held a desperate pleading that seemed to reach across the boundary between paint and reality. The image appeared to mouth the word help, confirming his worst fears about what had become of his beloved wife. Silverbrook found itself divided between those who still sought Whitmore's services despite the disappearances, and those who began to view the artist as a supernatural threat to their community. The division created tensions that threatened to tear apart the social fabric that had held the frontier town together through previous hardships and challenges. Those who had already received portraits defended Whitmore fiercely, claiming that the disappearances were coincidental and that the benefits of his artistic process far outweighed any potential risks. They formed a protective circle around the studio, preventing skeptics from interfering with ongoing appointments and dismissing concerns as superstitious nonsense born of ignorance and jealousy. Dr. Warren found himself leading the opposition, sharing his scientific findings with anyone willing to listen to evidence that challenged their preconceptions about the artist's true nature. However, his warnings fell on increasingly deaf ears as the transformed individuals seemed incapable of recognizing the danger they faced, their judgment clouded by the intoxicating effects of renewed youth. Reverend Stone attempted to bridge the divide through spiritual guidance, calling for prayer and reflection to help the community navigate the crisis. However, his congregation had largely abandoned traditional worship in favor of the immediate gratification offered by Whitmore's supernatural services, leaving the preacher to minister to an ever-shrinking flock of the unconverted. The economic implications of the crisis added another layer of complexity to the town's divisions. Businesses that had prospered from the influx of visitors seeking portraits faced financial ruin if Whitmore's activities were curtailed, while others recognized that the supernatural threat posed a greater danger to their community's long-term survival than any economic downturn. Reverend Stone's research into historical accounts of similar phenomena led him to ancient texts that spoke of entities capable of stealing human essence through artistic representation. These beings, known by various names across different cultures, were said to sustain themselves by absorbing the life force of their victims, leaving behind empty shells that gradually faded from existence. The preacher discovered references to protective rituals and binding ceremonies that could theoretically contain such entities, though the texts warned of severe consequences for those who attempted to confront beings of such power without proper spiritual preparation. The knowledge filled him with both hope for salvation and terror at the magnitude of the evil they faced. Stone's investigation revealed that Whitmore's arrival in Silverbrook had coincided with reports of similar disappearances in other frontier communities throughout the Colorado Territory. A pattern emerged of towns visited by mysterious artists who left behind trails of vanished residents and abandoned portraits, suggesting that their current tormentor was not unique, but part of a larger supernatural plague, the Reverend began secretly preparing sacred objects and protective symbols based on the ancient texts he had discovered, working throughout the night to craft weapons that might prove effective against an enemy that existed partially outside the physical realm. His hands trembled as he inscribed holy words onto silver bullets, uncertain whether his faith would prove strong enough to power the rituals required for their effectiveness. Most importantly, Stone discovered that the entities described in the texts were bound by certain limitations and compulsions that could potentially be exploited by those brave enough to face them directly. The knowledge came with warnings about the personal cost of such confrontations, but the preacher accepted that some prices were worth paying to save his community from damnation. Dr. Warren made the difficult decision to undergo a portrait session himself, believing that direct experience was the only way to fully understand the process and potentially find a way to reverse its effects. His scientific mind rebelled against the plan's obvious dangers, but his obligation to his patients and community outweighed his personal fears. The session took place on a gray February morning with snow falling steadily outside the studio windows. Whitmore seemed particularly pleased to have attracted such an educated subject, claiming that refined individuals produced the most satisfying results. The artist's enthusiasm sent chills through Warren's soul, confirming his worst suspicions about the true nature of the transformation process. As the painting progressed, Warren experienced sensations that defied medical understanding. He felt something essential being drawn from his body, as if his very life force was flowing through the artist's brushes onto the canvas. The process was neither painful nor pleasant, but profoundly disturbing in its fundamental violation of natural law and human dignity. The doctor managed to maintain his scientific objectivity throughout the session, mentally cataloging each strange sensation and observation for later analysis. He noted that Whitmore's appearance grew more vital as the painting neared completion, while Warren himself began to feel increasingly insubstantial, as if his physical form was losing coherence with each brushstroke. When the session concluded, Warren's reflection in the studio mirrors appeared younger and more vibrant, but he noticed that his shadow had become noticeably fainter. The portrait itself pulsed with an internal light that seemed to contain fragments of his consciousness, confirming his theory that the process involved the literal transfer of essence from subject to image. Dr. Warren's sacrifice provided crucial insights into Whitmore's true nature and the mechanics of his supernatural abilities. The artist was revealed to be a parasitic entity that fed on human life force, using the painting process as a method of gradually extracting and consuming the vital essence of his victims while maintaining a facade of beneficial transformation. The doctor discovered that the initial rejuvenation experienced by subjects was genuine but temporary, powered by the entity's own supernatural energy as bait to draw victims deeper into the process. With each additional session, more of the subject's true essence was transferred to the portrait, leaving behind an increasingly hollow shell that would eventually collapse entirely. Warren's medical background allowed him to recognize the symptoms of essence drain in ways that other victims had not understood. He felt his consciousness beginning to fragment, with portions of his personality and memory becoming accessible only when he gazed upon his portrait, as if crucial parts of himself had been imprisoned within the painted image. The doctor realized that Whitmore had been operating for decades, possibly centuries, moving from community to community and leaving behind a trail of vanished victims whose disappearances had been attributed to the hazards of frontier life. The entity's ageless appearance was maintained through the consumption of stolen life force, making it a predator perfectly adapted to prey upon isolated populations. Most importantly, Warren discovered that the connection between subject and portrait worked both ways. Just as the painting drew essence from the living person, it was theoretically possible for a strong-willed individual to reclaim their stolen life force by destroying the artwork that contained it, though such an attempt would likely prove fatal if not executed with perfect precision. Sheriff Morrison, Reverend Stone, and the rapidly fading Dr. Warren formed an unlikely alliance, united by their determination to stop Whitmore before more lives were lost to his supernatural hunger. Their combined expertise in law enforcement, spiritual warfare, and scientific analysis provided the foundation for a plan that might succeed where individual efforts had failed. The three men met secretly in the church basement, surrounded by religious artifacts and Warren's medical equipment, planning their assault on an enemy that existed partially outside the normal rules of reality. They knew their chances of survival were minimal, but their obligation to protect the remaining townspeople outweighed their fear of the consequences. Warren's deteriorating condition provided a sense of urgency to their preparations. The doctor estimated that he had perhaps a week before his essence was completely consumed, after which he would join Eleanor and the others in whatever fate awaited those who disappeared entirely. His clinical analysis of his own dissolution lent a grim precision to their timeline. Stone contributed ancient protective rituals and blessed weapons to their arsenal, while Morrison provided tactical expertise and knowledge of the studio's layout from his previous confrontations with the artist. Warren offered scientific insights into the entity's apparent weaknesses and the mechanics of the essence transfer process that might be exploited. Their plan required perfect coordination and absolute commitment, as any hesitation or failure would likely result not only in their deaths, but in the release of whatever supernatural forces Whitmore commanded. They prepared to face an enemy that had survived for centuries by consuming the life force of countless victims, armed only with faith, determination, and the desperate hope that good could triumph over ancient evil. The final confrontation took place during the darkest hour of a moonless night, when Whitmore's supernatural powers were theoretically at their weakest, according to the ancient texts that guided their strategy. The three allies approached the studio with weapons blessed by sacred rituals and hearts steeled for a battle that would determine the fate of their entire community. Morrison kicked down the studio door with explosive force, disrupting whatever mystical process Whitmore had been conducting among his collection of living portraits. The entity spun to face them with inhuman speed, his carefully maintained human facade cracking to reveal glimpses of something far older and more terrible than they had imagined. The studio erupted into supernatural chaos as Whitmore's true nature was finally revealed in all its horrifying glory. His form shifted and writhed, sometimes appearing as the pale artist they had known, other times manifesting as something that belonged to nightmares rather than the waking world. The portraits that lined the walls began to scream with the voices of their trapped subjects, Reverend Stone began chanting protective incantations in Latin, his voice rising above the supernatural cacophony that filled the studio. The blessed silver bullets in Morrison's revolver glowed with holy light as he opened fire, each shot striking the entity with force that seemed to come from divine rather than mundane sources. Dr. Warren, despite his weakened condition, moved with purpose toward his own portrait, understanding that breaking the connection between himself and the painted image might disrupt Whitmore's power over the other trapped victims. The entity realized his intention and turned the full force of his supernatural wrath upon the doctor, beginning a struggle that would determine the outcome of their desperate gambit. The confrontation between Warren and Whitmore transcended physical combat, becoming a battle for the very souls trapped within the portraits that lined the studio walls. The doctor's scientific mind provided unexpected protection against the entity's psychic assaults, his rational worldview serving as armor against attacks designed to overwhelm victims with supernatural terror and confusion. Morrison's blessed ammunition proved effective against the creature, each silver bullet causing visible damage to Whitmore's shifting form and disrupting his ability to maintain human appearance. However, the entity's supernatural resilience allowed it to absorb tremendous punishment while continuing to fight with inhuman strength and speed that tested the sheriff's considerable combat experience. Stone's religious incantations created barriers of holy light that contained Whitmore's power within the studio, preventing the entity from escaping to prey upon other communities. The preacher's faith blazed like a beacon in the darkness, his words carrying power that came from sources beyond human understanding and struck at the heart of the evil they faced. The portraits themselves became active participants in the battle, with some screaming warnings to their would-be rescuers, while others, more completely corrupted by Whitmore's influence, turned against the three allies. The studio filled with spectral manifestations of the artist's victims, creating a supernatural battlefield where the boundaries between life and death held no meaning. Warren finally reached his portrait and, with hands that trembled from more than fear, began the process of reclaiming his stolen essence. The painting fought back with a will of its own, but the doctor's understanding of the connection between subject and image allowed him to begin unraveling the mystical bonds that held his life force captive. As Warren succeeded in destroying his portrait and reclaiming his essence, a chain reaction began throughout the studio as other trapped souls found the strength to break free from their painted prisons. The supernatural energy that had sustained Whitmore for centuries began to unravel, causing the entity's form to destabilize in ways that shook the very foundations of reality. Whitmore's death throes released waves of psychic energy that threatened to consume everyone in the studio, forcing Stone to expand his protective barriers to their maximum extent, while Morrison continued his relentless assault with the remaining blessed ammunition. The entity's screams carried the voices of all its victims throughout the centuries, a chorus of suffering that finally found release. The portraits began to crumble and burn with supernatural fire that consumed the stolen essence they contained, releasing it to return to its rightful owners or pass peacefully into whatever realm awaited the dead. Eleanor Morrison's image smiled at her husband one final time before dissolving into motes of golden light that danced briefly in the air before fading away. Dr. Warren collapsed as his reclaimed life force flooded back into his body, the shock of reintegration nearly killing him, despite his scientific preparation for the process. His sacrifice had provided the key to victory, but the cost of his ordeal would mark him for the remainder of his days with knowledge of realms beyond human understanding. As the studio burned with fires that could not be extinguished by earthly means, the three survivors stumbled into the snowy street to watch the end of a nightmare that had nearly consumed their entire community. The flames cast no heat despite their intensity, and by morning, nothing remained of Whitmore's studio but a patch of bare earth that would never again support growth. Silverbrook awakened to find itself forever changed by the supernatural crisis that had nearly claimed its soul. Those who had received portraits but avoided the entity's complete consumption found themselves returned to their natural ages, their stolen years restored, but carrying new wisdom about the price of vanity and the dangers of seeking shortcuts to happiness. The town's economy collapsed without the influx of visitors seeking Whitmore's services, forcing residents to return to the harsh realities of frontier life. However, many found that their experience with supernatural horror had strengthened their appreciation for simple human pleasures and the bonds of community that held them together through adversity. Dr. Margaret Whitfield arrived in Leadville 3 months after Samuel's disappearance, drawn by reports of the mysterious portrait. A folklore specialist from Harvard, she had dedicated her career to documenting American ghost stories and unexplained phenomena. Her weathered leather journal contained accounts of similar supernatural occurrences across the frontier territories. The aging scholar possessed an academic curiosity that often overrode common sense when investigating the paranormal. The portrait now hung in the town's makeshift museum, housed in the abandoned general store. Margaret spent hours studying the painting's intricate details, noting how the subject's eyes seemed to track movement across the room. She documented the way shadows fell unnaturally within the painted scene, creating depth that shouldn't exist on a flat canvas. The brushwork showed masterful technique, yet something about the paint itself seemed wrong, almost alive beneath her magnifying glass. Local testimonies revealed a disturbing pattern that Margaret carefully recorded in her research. Every person who had extended contact with the painting reported the same phenomena: vivid nightmares, a sense of being watched, and gradual aging that seemed accelerated beyond natural processes. The museum curator, once a vibrant woman of 40, now appeared decades older after just weeks of proximity to the portrait. These accounts aligned with similar cases Margaret had encountered in her studies of cursed objects. Margaret's investigation into Samuel Hayes revealed a man consumed by artistic ambition and desperate for recognition. Town records showed he had purchased unusual art supplies from traveling merchants, including pigments of unknown origin that cost him nearly everything he owned. His journal entries, discovered in his abandoned cabin, spoke of transcendent techniques and capturing the very essence of time itself. The final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, mentioned achieving the breakthrough that will make me immortal. As Margaret delved deeper into the painting's history, she began experiencing the same unsettling symptoms described by others. Her reflection in mirrors showed subtle signs of aging that seemed to accelerate with each passing day. Sleep brought nightmares of endless corridors filled with portraits, each one trapping a soul within its painted confines. The scholar realized she was witnessing something that challenged every rational explanation she had ever accepted about the nature of reality itself. Margaret's breakthrough came when she discovered an ancient text hidden within Samuel's art supplies, written in a mixture of Latin and symbols she couldn't identify. The manuscript described a ritual for transferring life essence through artistic representation. The technique promised eternal youth to the artist, while condemning the subject to bear the burden of aging within the painted realm. Samuel had apparently stumbled upon this forbidden knowledge through his desperate search for artistic immortality. The ritual required specific ingredients that Margaret traced to Samuel's mysterious suppliers. Mercury, extracted from Colorado mines, mixed with pigments derived from rare minerals found only in certain mountain caves, created paint that could supposedly capture and manipulate the life force itself. The process demanded absolute precision and unwavering commitment from the artist, as any mistake would result in the creator being trapped instead of the subject. Samuel's journal revealed months of careful preparation for this supernatural gamble. Margaret realized that Thomas Hartwell hadn't simply been Samuel's model. He had been an unwilling sacrifice. The businessman's frequent visits to the studio weren't just social calls, but necessary sessions for the ritual's completion. Each sitting had transferred more of Thomas's life essence into the painting, while preserving Samuel's youth through some dark metaphysical exchange. The portrait served as a supernatural prison, containing Thomas's soul while his physical body aged and died elsewhere. The scholar's investigation revealed that Samuel hadn't disappeared. He had achieved exactly what he sought. Witness accounts from neighboring towns described a young man matching Samuel's description, appearing unchanged despite the passage of months. He was systematically moving from place to place, likely seeking new subjects or additional portraits to maintain his unnatural condition. The original painting remained in Leadville as evidence of his terrible success. Margaret faced an agonizing decision as her own condition worsened from exposure to the cursed artwork. Her research suggested that destroying the portrait might release Thomas's trapped soul, but could also unleash the dark forces Samuel had harnessed. The alternative was allowing the painting to continue claiming victims while Samuel roamed freely, potentially creating more supernatural prisons. The weight of this choice pressed upon her as heavily as the unnatural aging that now marked her features. Margaret spent her remaining strength researching methods to safely destroy the cursed portrait. Ancient texts suggested that supernatural artwork could only be unmade through specific rituals that reversed the original creation process. The scholar gathered materials during increasingly difficult trips to local suppliers, her aged body struggling with tasks that had once been effortless. Time was running short as the painting's influence grew stronger with each passing day. The ritual required precise timing, aligning with astronomical conditions that occurred only during the new moon. Margaret prepared the abandoned museum as her makeshift sanctum, arranging blessed salt in protective circles around the portrait. She had written detailed instructions for Sheriff Morrison should she fail to survive the attempt. The townspeople watched from a safe distance as the determined scholar made her final stand against the dark forces plaguing their community. As midnight approached, Margaret began the counter-ritual using Samuel's own notes translated backwards. She applied blessed oils to the painting's frame while reciting Latin incantations designed to break the supernatural bonds holding Thomas's soul. The portrait immediately began to react, its painted surface rippling like disturbed water as otherworldly energies fought against her efforts. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and shadows moved independently of their sources. The painting's resistance grew violent as Margaret continued her work. Windows shattered throughout the building, while an unnatural wind howled through the structure, carrying whispers in languages that predated human civilization. The scholar pressed forward despite physical pain that felt like her very life force was being drained. Thomas's painted figure began to move within the frame, his mouth opening in a silent scream of either agony or relief. At the ritual's climax, Margaret made the ultimate sacrifice required to break Samuel's dark magic. She pressed her hands directly onto the painted surface, allowing her own life essence to surge into the portrait and overwhelm the supernatural bonds. The exchange was immediate and devastating. Her body crumbled to dust while brilliant light erupted from the canvas. When Sheriff Morrison entered the museum at dawn, he found only ash and a blank canvas where the cursed portrait had hung. Sheriff Morrison's official report became the definitive account of the supernatural events that plagued Leadville during that terrible winter. His methodical documentation provided future researchers with detailed testimony about the cursed portrait and its ultimate destruction. The lawman had witnessed enough unexplained phenomena to believe Margaret's theories about Samuel Hayes and his dark artistic practices. His badge had protected him from supernatural threats, but couldn't shield him from the emotional weight, the tragedy. The blank canvas remained in the museum as evidence of Margaret's sacrifice, though most visitors assumed it was simply an empty frame awaiting new artwork. Morrison noticed that people who stared too long at the vacant surface reported feeling uneasy, as if something invisible was watching them from within the white expanse. The sheriff made sure the canvas was eventually moved to secure storage, fearing that residual supernatural energy might still pose a danger to unsuspecting viewers. Samuel Hayes was never seen again after Margaret's ritual, leading Morrison to theorize that destroying the original portrait had somehow undone all of the artist's dark work. Without the supernatural anchor that maintained his stolen youth, Samuel likely aged rapidly back to his natural state before crumbling to dust somewhere in the wilderness. The sheriff occasionally received reports of a mysterious young man matching Samuel's description, but these sightings always proved to be cases of mistaken identity. Morrison's investigation revealed that similar incidents had occurred in other frontier towns where traveling artists offered portrait services. The American West, with its isolation and desperate populations, provided perfect hunting grounds for those who practiced dark arts. His reports to territorial authorities helped establish protocols for investigating supernatural crimes, though such cases were often dismissed by officials who refused to acknowledge otherworldly explanations. The sheriff knew better than most that evil took many forms on the frontier. The lawman spent his remaining years documenting other cases of Western horror and dark folklore, building a comprehensive archive of supernatural incidents that plagued frontier communities. His work provided crucial historical context for understanding how American folklore developed during westward expansion. Morrison's files contained dozens of testimonies about cursed objects, haunted locations, and individuals who had made terrible bargains for power or immortality. These true horror stories revealed the darker side of the American dream. Father Miguel conducted memorial services for both Thomas Hartwell and Dr. Margaret Whitfield, honoring their sacrifices in the battle against supernatural evil. The priest had witnessed enough during his frontier ministry to understand that some evils required ultimate sacrifice to defeat. His sermons began incorporating lessons about the dangers of pride and the pursuit of power at any cost. The small church became a sanctuary where survivors could process their trauma and find spiritual healing after the supernatural ordeal. Elizabeth Hartwell inherited her husband's business empire, but never fully recovered from the traumatic loss and supernatural circumstances surrounding his death. She established a foundation dedicated to supporting families affected by unexplained tragedies, understanding that conventional grief counseling couldn't address the unique trauma of supernatural encounters. Her wealth-funded research into American folklore and historical horror stories, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared for such encounters. Elizabeth's philanthropic work became her way of honoring both her husband's memory and Margaret's sacrifice. The townspeople of Leadville gradually returned to normal life, though the events had left permanent psychological scars on the community. Children who had been present during the supernatural manifestations grew into adults who instinctively avoided certain artistic subjects and supernatural themes. Local folklore evolved to include warnings about accepting portrait commissions from unknown artists, and mothers told cautionary tales about the dangers of vanity and artistic ambition. These cultural adaptations served as psychological protection against similar future threats. Doc Peterson documented the medical aspects of the supernatural encounters, noting how exposure to cursed objects could cause accelerated aging and psychological distress. His clinical observations provided valuable insight into how the human body responded to paranormal influences. The physician's records became important historical documents for researchers studying the intersection of medicine and supernatural phenomena. Peterson's work helped establish that supernatural horror stories often contained grains of medical and psychological truth. The surviving witnesses formed an informal support network, meeting monthly to share their experiences and provide mutual understanding that couldn't be found elsewhere. Their gatherings served both therapeutic and protective purposes, as the group remained vigilant for signs of similar supernatural threats. These meetings became the foundation for Colorado's first folklore preservation society, dedicated to documenting and researching unexplained phenomena throughout the American West. Their work ensured that the lessons learned from Samuel Hayes's terrible legacy would not be forgotten. Samuel Hayes's abandoned cabin became a site of morbid curiosity for travelers and researchers interested in the supernatural events that had terrorized Leadville. Visitors found remnants of his dark artistic practices scattered throughout the space, strange pigments that seemed to move of their own accord, brushes that felt unnaturally warm to the touch, and sketches that appeared to change when viewed peripherally. The cabin served as a grim museum of artistic ambition, corrupted by supernatural forces and desperate desire for immortality. Art historians who studied Samuel's remaining works identified a progression from conventional portraiture toward increasingly disturbing supernatural experimentation. His early paintings showed traditional technical skill and artistic sensitivity, but later pieces revealed an obsession with capturing something beyond mere physical appearance. The evolution of his artistic style provided a roadmap of how creative passion could be twisted into something monstrous when combined with forbidden knowledge and unlimited ambition. Several of Samuel's preliminary sketches survived the supernatural destruction, offering insight into his methodical approach to the dark ritual. These drawings showed detailed anatomical studies combined with occult symbols and mathematical calculations that suggested careful planning rather than impulsive evil. Scholars noted that Samuel had approached supernatural art with the same dedication that legitimate artists brought to mastering traditional techniques. His corruption represented a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without considering moral consequences. The materials Samuel used for his cursed portraits were traced to their sources throughout the Colorado Territory. Investigation revealed a network of suppliers who specialized in providing unusual substances to customers with supernatural interests. Many of these merchants were Native Americans who understood the dangerous power of certain materials but sold them to desperate settlers willing to pay extraordinary prices. This trade in supernatural supplies represented a dark economic undercurrent in the frontier economy. Samuel's story became part of Colorado folklore, serving as a warning about the price of unchecked artistic ambition and the dangers of seeking immortality through supernatural means. Local storytellers embellished the tale over time, but the core message remained consistent. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, and some prices were too high to pay for worldly success. The artist's legacy evolved from personal tragedy into cultural wisdom that helped protect future generations from similar temptations. The supernatural events in Leadville revealed broader patterns of dark folklore that permeated American frontier culture during westward expansion. Researchers discovered similar incidents throughout the Western territories, suggesting that the combination of isolation, desperation, and cultural displacement created conditions conducive to supernatural manifestations. Native American shamans confirmed that the disruption of ancient spiritual boundaries during settlement had awakened dormant forces that occasionally corrupted unprepared individuals like Samuel Hayes. Dr. Margaret Whitfield's research notes, preserved by Sheriff Morrison, provided valuable insight into the prevalence of cursed objects and supernatural practitioners throughout the American West. Her documentation revealed that frontier communities regularly encountered unexplained phenomena, but rarely reported such incidents to territorial authorities, who dismissed supernatural explanations. This pattern of official denial left communities vulnerable to repeated supernatural threats, while preventing the development of effective countermeasures and protective protocols. The economic desperation that drove Samuel Hayes to seek supernatural solutions reflected broader social conditions throughout the frontier territories. Many settlers faced financial ruin and social isolation that made them vulnerable to offers of supernatural assistance or promises of impossible success. Unscrupulous practitioners exploited these vulnerabilities, offering magical solutions to problems that required practical approaches. The prevalence of such exploitation contributed to the development of Western folklore traditions that warned against supernatural shortcuts and emphasized traditional values. Military officials began documenting supernatural incidents after Sheriff Morrison's reports reached territorial headquarters, leading to the establishment of informal protocols for investigating unexplained phenomena. These procedures recognized that frontier law enforcement needed specialized knowledge to handle supernatural crimes and protect civilian populations from otherworldly threats. The military's acknowledgement of supernatural dangers represented a significant shift in official attitudes toward American folklore and indigenous spiritual traditions. The cultural impact of the Hayes incident extended beyond Colorado, influencing how frontier communities approached artistic patronage and cultural development. Towns became more cautious about unknown artists and traveling cultural figures, developing informal screening processes to identify potentially dangerous individuals. This cultural adaptation represented a practical response to supernatural threats, while also contributing to the distinctive paranoid elements that characterized frontier psychology. The balance between openness to culture and protection from danger became a defining aspect of Western community development. Government archivists eventually classified the Hayes incident as part of a broader study of frontier psychology and cultural adaptation during westward expansion. Official documents carefully avoided supernatural explanations while acknowledging that unusual phenomena had occurred in Leadville during the specified time period. This bureaucratic approach reflected the federal government's reluctance to validate supernatural explanations while recognizing the need to document significant social disturbances. The sanitized historical record preserved basic facts while obscuring the true nature of the events. Academic historians who studied the incident decades later found themselves divided between those who accepted supernatural explanations and skeptics who attributed the events to mass hysteria and psychological suggestion. The debate reflected broader scholarly tensions between empirical methodology and acknowledgement of unexplained phenomena in historical research. Primary source documents supported the supernatural interpretation, but academic conventions demanded rational explanations for irrational events. This scholarly conflict ensured continued interest in the Hayes case among folklore researchers. Native American oral traditions provided crucial context for understanding the supernatural forces that Samuel Hayes had unknowingly unleashed through his dark artistic practices. Tribal elders confirmed that certain locations in Colorado possessed spiritual significance that made them conducive to otherworldly manifestations when proper protocols weren't observed. Their knowledge suggested that Samuel's ritual had violated ancient spiritual boundaries, triggering responses from forces that predated European settlement. This indigenous perspective offered explanations that European American culture couldn't provide. The preservation of witness testimonies created a valuable historical record of how frontier communities processed and adapted to supernatural threats during the late 19th century. These documents revealed sophisticated folk psychology and community support systems that helped survivors cope with traumatic encounters beyond conventional understanding. The testimonies also demonstrated how supernatural events influenced local folklore development and cultural transmission patterns. Future researchers found these accounts invaluable for understanding the psychological dimensions of frontier life. Museum curators eventually recognized the Hayes incident as a significant example of American supernatural folklore with historical documentation that surpassed most ghost stories and unexplained phenomena. The availability of multiple independent witness accounts, official documentation, and physical evidence made the case exceptional among supernatural incidents from the frontier period. This recognition led to increased scholarly interest in Western horror and dark folklore as legitimate subjects for historical research and cultural preservation. The empty museum in Leadville stands today as a silent testament to the supernatural events that once terrorized the community during that dark winter of 1868. Visitors occasionally report feeling watched while exploring the abandoned building, though skeptics attribute such sensations to suggestion and atmospheric conditions. The blank canvas where Samuel Hayes's cursed portrait once hung remains in storage, occasionally examined by researchers who claim to sense residual supernatural energy within the empty frame. These continuing anomalies suggest that some mysteries transcend complete resolution. Modern paranormal investigators who study the Hayes case find parallels in contemporary reports of cursed artwork and supernatural artistic practices throughout the world. The internet age has revealed similar incidents across different cultures and time periods, suggesting that the corruption of artistic creation represents a universal supernatural danger. Samuel's story serves as a cautionary tale for contemporary artists who might be tempted to explore forbidden techniques or seek success through supernatural means. The warning remains relevant despite changes in artistic mediums and cultural contexts. The descendants of Leadville survivors continue to pass down family stories about the supernatural events, ensuring that community memory preserves lessons learned from the tragic encounter with dark artistic forces. These oral traditions emphasize the importance of moral boundaries and the dangers of unchecked ambition in creative pursuits. Children grow up understanding that some knowledge carries terrible prices and that artistic success achieved through supernatural means ultimately destroys both creator and community. This cultural wisdom protects future generations from similar temptations. Contemporary folklore researchers recognize the Hayes incident as a prime example of how American supernatural traditions developed during periods of cultural transition and geographic expansion. The story demonstrates how frontier conditions created environments where ancient supernatural forces could influence desperate individuals seeking solutions to modern problems. This historical pattern helps explain why ghost stories and dark folklore remain persistent elements in American culture, serving both entertainment and protective functions for communities facing uncertainty. The legacy of Samuel Hayes reminds us that evil often disguises itself as opportunity, and that the pursuit of immortality through supernatural means invariably leads to spiritual death. His story joins countless other tales of Western horror and American folklore that warn against pride, greed, and the abandonment of moral principles in pursuit of worldly success. These true horror stories from our frontier past continue to offer valuable lessons about the price of unchecked ambition and the importance of community vigilance against supernatural threats that persist in every generation.